In 1957, the Ferrari Formula 1 team had 5 drivers, all of immense skill and equally rich backstories. They would drive in tight little circles every Sunday, risking their lives in the pursuit of glamour and romance. 2 years later, by 1959, all would be dead, 4 in their Ferraris, 1 on the side of the A3. This is a story of great heroism and great sportsmanship, amongst a backdrop of unspeakable horror. For these brief but well-lived 2 years, Ferrari had 5 drivers, 2 Italians, Luigi Musso and Eugenio Castellotti, 2 Brits, Mike Hawthorn and Peter Collins, and a Marquis, Alfonso de Portago, Spanish by record but positively international in the way all descendants of royalty are. Portago once spoke about the outlook that these dashing drivers of the 50s had.
There's another thing connected with automobile racing which might sound a little bit corny, but it's very true. Racing drivers live very near to death every Sunday afternoon. But you'll find that it gives us a greater appreciation of life. And you'll find that drivers that are a very happy lot of people. Because they appreciate life far more than the average man does.
The 2 Italians, Castellotti and Musso, would drive under immense pressure, representing Ferrari as Italians. De Portago was a playboy, the handsome aristocrat, fluent in 4 languages. His godfather was Alfonso VIII, King of Spain, naturally, whilst Mike Hawthorn would drive wearing his distinctive spotted bow tie and green racing jacket. Enzo Ferrari, affectionately named the Old Man, would like to play them off against each other, often having too many drivers for cars, ensuring every driver would feel under pressure, believing the more pressure you put on them, the faster they will go. To get more of an insight into this story, I spoke to David Treymane, F1 journalist and historian, co-founder of F1 e-magazine Grand Prix Plus. Treymane has also written extensively on the sport's history. Well, thank you for coming along today, David. Now, let me ask you, do we tend to romanticise the early years of Formula 1? I mean, they're usually seen as the sport's sort of golden years, and yet death and tragedy were seemingly more prevalent than anything else back then.
It's kind of easy to romanticise that, but I tell you what's really interesting, when you're writing about it, it's dead easy to romanticise anything. When you're in the middle of it, if you're in a car that's going upside down at high speed, for example, there's nothing romantic about that. And the doing it makes you aware that, I mean, those were bloody days. They weren't romantic at all. Even at the time, they probably seemed it to people like Hawthorn and Collins. But they all knew what the backdrop really was. And if you look at that, the 50s were arguably the most dangerous era in the whole of F1's history.
And how good was that group of Ferrari drivers from 1957 to 1958? You know, with Musso and Castellotti, De Portago, Mike Hawthorn and Peter Collins, all looking equally parts the dashing racer and movie star.
I think it's fair to say that Hawthorn and Collins were the genuine thing. They were both really good. They were world champion material. Obviously, Mike was world champion. Peter should have been. You've got to look at people in their time, haven't you? After the war, everyone would want to be out there being rambunctious and having a fun time, and Mike certainly was a hedonist. Castellotti and Musso were typical Ferrari fodder, for want of a better expression. 2 charismatic young men, very Italian. Ferrari just loved having the 2 of them and setting them against each other. And that's the way he played the game. He couldn't do that with Hawthorn and Collins, much to his irritation. Castellotti and Musso were quick. They were very good sports car racers. They weren't quite number 2 drivers, but they weren't quite number 1. They could rise to the occasion. But I think it's fair to say, particularly with Musso, they were always kind of hanging on by their fingertips. Portago, well, there's an interesting case. I mean, I can't even remember how many first names he had, let alone what they all are, but it must have been about 7 or 8. I mean, he was bobsleigh, tennis, boxing, horse riding. He could do anything. And he was quite quick in a car. So he was this super character that just, again, very charismatic. I remember Jabby Crombach, the French doyen journalist who knew him quite well in period. Jabby suggesting that he didn't understand what deodorants were for, but maybe that was part of his appeal to women, because he was just one of those guys that went through life with a lot of wealth, doing a lot of things really well, probably never going to make old bones. So you had this kind of mix of them all, and Ferrari would pull them in and out. Castellotti is a case in point. Young Italian sacrificed on the altar of Ferrari's ego, if you like.
Now, you mentioned Castellotti's death there. Why did Enzo have such a fascination in holding the lap record there around Modena?
It was just pride. And he had sort of Maserati one side of Modena, Ferrari the other. And, that was just it. It was an ego thing, and he wanted the honour of having the fastest car.
To take it back now to 1955 and Le Mans then, the scene of the worst accident in sporting history, did the crash shape Hawthorn for his whole career? That reminder of death in motorsport, and of course, photographs from after the race show him conflicted whether to celebrate this Le Mans victory or mourn the tragedy.
I think Hawthorne caused that, and I know from accounts of the tragedy and speaking to people who were there that he was in pieces. But he was completely, I've done this, I've caused it. And then at the end, it was Paris Match, or one of the French papers showed a picture of Hawthorne sort of drinking champagne with Ivor afterwards, and the caption was just something like, Santé, Monsieur Hawthorne, amid all the pictures of the carnage and everything else. I think that affected him hugely. I also think Mike was, you couldn't live at that time and not be very aware of mortality. A lot of people at the time, it wasn't exactly unusual to have accidents where cars went into the crowd. I mean, if it happened now, you would have serious questions asked about motor racing, wouldn't you? But then it was so soon after the war, it was just kind of carnage again. We're used to this.
Well, sadly, talking about cars going into the crowd, the 1957 Mille Miglia is another case in point, and another chapter in motorsport's close relationship with death.
The biggest impact of the Mille Miglia, with the children being killed and everything else, was the effect it had on Ferrari, because he became so conflicted. I understand that, because what he was trying to do was build a fantastic Italian team, and then suddenly here's his country turning around, pillorying him for something that was, after all, an accident. But at the time, yes, it was a huge thing for Ferrari, and I think that probably took a fair bit for him to recover from. And also, I would imagine that's part of the reason, another one where he retreated more into his shell as a kind of self-protective mechanism.
And of course, there's that beautiful shot of Portago kissing Linda Christian minutes before he would drive to his death. He said there was no time to change the tyre that went on to kill him, yet always found time for a kiss.
Well, he's got his priorities right, hasn't he?
Moving on to Luigi Musso now, and his death at Reims in 1958. Was Musso a bit of a tortured soul, sort of bullied by the Brits, Collins and Hawthorn, failed business ventures, growing debts, and of course the immense pressure of being an Italian driving the red car?
Yeah, I think that's all true. Number one, he felt that very intensely. And if you remember, in Monza the year before, they ran on the banking and they knew the tyres were going to be dodgy. And Castellotti and Musso just went into this stupid dogfight straight away. And of course, they both blew tyres and ruined their chances in the race. But there was huge pressure on both to be the number one. And like we've said, neither of them were quite in the same class. Even if it didn't happen, I can imagine him feeling that Hawthorn and Collins was kind of them against me. And anyway, they're all competing because obviously they're teammates. And as we've said, Ferrari would pit them all against each other. But Hawthorn and Collins, with their Mon Ami mate thing, was so tight together, they couldn't be separated. So he would have been under a lot of pressure there. And he was just pushing too hard because of all the pressures. And there's stories about the mafia being on him for gambling debts. and everything else. And, so much depended on him establishing himself and winning races. So the pressure on him was enormous. I always felt sorry for Musso. And he had the glamorous girlfriend, and he was a good-looking guy. It's just a sad story.
And then a month later, the German Grand Prix, Nürburgring. A sort of cauldron of death, that track always. Peter Collins would die at the wheel there. How big an impact was his death on Enzo, given the close relationship between Collins and Enzo's terminally ill son, Dino? But also the impact on his sort of mon ami mate, as they used to call it each other, Mike Hawthorn.
If you think about that period and all the guys that have died, and obviously there was Ascari as well, not just for Italian motorsport in terms of drivers and the Ferrari team, but for Enzo Ferrari, all these personal tragedies. And he'd had a little bit of a spat with Peter and had punished him a couple of times, but, he could see that Collins had championship potential. And I think in some ways he was almost like another son with Ferrari, and especially with the relationship with Dino. I think he was quite sentimental about all of that. And Collins was a decent bloke, but he was raffish, sort of good-looking film star kind of looks and everything else. But I think fundamentally he was a very, very decent guy and did the right thing and was honourable and polite. And, what he did with Fangio at Monza in 56, when both Castellotti and Musso were asked to give up their cars to Fangio and refused. And Collins just came in and got out and gave the car to Fangio, having given his car to Fangio in Monaco as well, so that Fangio could go on and win another title. And his attitude then was, I've got plenty of time. Well, of course, in retrospect, that's very poignant, isn't it? So I think of all his drivers of that era, I think Collins was probably quite easily Ferrari's favourite. And of course, the impact on Mike was enormous. Just a massive, all the fun went out of his racing then. And I think he'd already decided to retire if he won the title anyway. And I think that just hastened that decision. They were literally best buddies, and very, very close. Did a load of things together, just on each other's wavelength. It's hard to think of anyone since who had quite the same friendship.
Hawthorn then becomes the first Brit to win the World Championship in 1958, beating the late Stirling Moss by just 1 point. The great irony then followed that he had escaped the constant reminders of death for 6 or so years in F1, only to die on the British motorway, the A3, only a few months after his retirement.
That's a very interesting story. I talked to Rob Walker a lot about that, and Rob would never admit that they were racing, obviously. But Mike did not like German cars. He did not like German cars at all. And I remember Rob saying that as soon as he spotted the Gullwing coming up, he was sort of foot down and pushing hard. And Rob would never pretend to be in Mike's class as a driver. But the Merc would have been a match, more than a match, even for a tuned Mark I Jag. And how ironic that all the things that Mike got away with in his career, just one small error with a narrow rear tracked car, and it's all over. I mean, it is sad what happened to Hawthorn equally. I think he'd have had a very difficult life with the kidney thing because you didn't have transplants or anything at that time. And the feeling is he was on borrowed time even before he'd finished racing. And that's another reason why, if you look, sometimes he was quite an up and down driver. Sometimes he was right on it, like Rams in 53 when he beat Fangio. Other times he was so-so. And in retrospect, you realise that were probably the days when he was more affected by the kidney problem than on others. So quite a tragic character in the end, Hawthorn.
Less than 10 years after the creation of the sport, F1 was an untamed beast. The Cavalier drivers of the 1950s went out to perform a show. To try and tame the beast of motorsport, wrestle with it, dare each other to see how long they could stay on top of the beast without being thrown off and killed. These drivers drove on the limit, always. However, they probably wouldn't appreciate a soppy-eyed salute to their deaths. They simply weren't like that, instead preferring a rich celebration of all that was good and hedonistic about their lives. A more accurate obituary was made by one American journalist. The clip was made after Portago's death in 1957, but it is just a fitting tribute to the rest of the group of 50s drivers. Drivers truly unique to their era.
In pursuit of new adventures, he exhausted the dangerous sports and distinguished himself at all of them. That he should be killed on the threshold of a magnificent racing career is a great loss to racing and to the world of people who still retain an ounce of romance in them. Yet it is somehow fitting. By the very nature of their lives, people like Portago do not die in bed. Their flags remain flying on the many competitive fields where they enjoyed their greatest triumphs to the very end.